Well, Douglas Murray, of course, the author of 7 books, including The War on the West and The Strange Death of Europe. He joins Rita every week and he joins me now. Douglas, welcome. Now, you've written a piece in The Spectator this week about the Italian island of Lampedusa, which is at the centre of an illegal migration crisis. Now, this island has a local population of 6,000 people, but they had 7,000 illegal arrivals in just 48 hours last week. And you were there 8 years ago and gave a pretty dire prognosis of the situation at the time. The latest developments, you have to say, even though Giorgia Meloni was elected on a platform of reducing this illegal migration, it's not terribly unexpected, is it?
No, it's not. As you say, I was on Lampedusa in 2015, when the migration crisis was starting in the Mediterranean. It resulted in way over 1 million people illegally entering Europe from sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and many other places. And I saw then, in my resulting book, The Strange Death of Europe, diagnosed what I thought was going to happen based on what I'd seen. Back then, the island was struggling with, a couple of thousand people and trying to get them off the island, and then another couple of thousand would arrive and they'd get them off. And they just pushed the problem north, and pushed it north to Sicily, then to mainland Italy, and from there into the rest of Europe. And the Italians then said 2 things. 1, we can't cope, we can't do this alone. 2, well, the EU needs to do more. Giorgia Meloni, the most right-wing Prime Minister of Italy to be elected for some time, came to power recently on the promise that she was going to reduce the migration. And there she was in Lampedusa this week with Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU, saying, again, Italy can't do this alone. We need more help from the EU. And I just thought, nothing has changed except that the problem is getting worse. And it's a real lesson for all countries in Europe, but all of the developed world. The numbers of people who want to come to countries like Australia, Europe, North America is infinite. It's hundreds of millions in sub-Saharan Africa alone that want to come to Europe. Europe cannot take them, but Europe seems incapable of repelling them or deterring them. And in that lies an awful lot of pain and misery for the European peoples in the years ahead.
How is it that Europe is unable to repel these people? Because, of course, in Australia, in 2013, the Abbott government was elected on the policy of stop the boats, and they did that very successfully. And it sort of backed the opposition, the Labor Party, into a corner, and they have supported boat turnbacks ever since. And it's been done with great success. Why can't that be done in Europe?
What Prime Minister Abbott did then was the gold standard for what any democratic government ought to do in this situation. You either have a border or not. If you don't have a border, you don't have a country. Abbott recognized that, as other Australian prime ministers have done as well, but he deserves a credit for that. And what he crucially realized was, again, the number of people who can come to Australia is infinite if you just allow the first ones. Now, unfortunately, the European leaders, much like the current administration in Washington, just doesn't seem to have the guts to do the necessary thing. It endlessly talks about, the needs of the people coming, never about the needs of the people in the countries. European taxpayers don't pay their taxes throughout their lives simply to support an endless welfare state for the third world coming in. And it's not like Europe is just a landing craft of some kind. It's not just an aircraft carrier for the people of the world who want to come. It's a civilization, it's a set of nations, it's a set of peoples, and it cannot infinitely just imbibe millions and millions of people from the developing world. And unfortunately, until such a time as politicians in Europe get serious, like the Australian government did, this problem is going to go on and on. And I just add one thing, if I may, which is this. As I say in The Spectator, it is salutary to notice that a politician like Matteo Salvini in Italy, who stopped the boats, refused to allow them to land, which is the correct policy, has been prosecuted twice in Italy for that. He is treated as a criminal when he is the one that was doing the most basic and legal thing necessary.
Why would you bother, I suppose, is the message out of that. Now, you've also written this week about the ludicrous push by the New York City Council to remove some of the city's most famous monuments, including, of course, a statue of Christopher Columbus. And apparently this is all in an effort to help the city, quote-unquote, come to terms with its history. But seriously, I mean, how do you ever, quote-unquote, come to terms with your history if you are actively wiping out history? I mean, surely the answer, I know it happens everywhere, surely the answer, if you want statues of other people, build statues of other people. How hard is it?
Oh, I've got an even better idea. If you don't like our heroes, make some heroes of your own.
Yeah, exactly.
Get your own incredibly heroic and brilliant people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Maybe these people just can't find them. I suspect that is the case. And because they don't have them, they want to tear down everyone else's heroes. It's an extraordinary thing. It started a couple of years ago when the New York City Council voted to remove a statue of Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, one of the greatest men who's ever lived, I think. They now, of course, have moved on to George Washington, and Christopher Columbus once again is back in their sights, because we're talking here about idiot critics who basically think it would have been better if Christopher Columbus had never set out and never discovered the New World, or had gone back home and said nothing really there to see. These people are ignoramuses, these critics. There are apparently 2,500 suspicious statues and monuments in New York, according to the woman in charge of this ridiculous exercise. She stands as judge, jury, and executioner on the past. I suspect that future generations, if there are any, will look back with much more contempt on the people doing this act of iconoclasm in the 2020s than they will on the great men who founded America in the 18th century.
Indeed, we live in the new era of censorship, really, don't we? And one council on the other end of the spectrum is a city council in Michigan, which voted recently to ban any religious, ethnic, racial, political or sexual orientation group flags on city buildings. So, it's essentially a ban on flying the pride flag. This town, Hamtramck, is got an all-Muslim council these days. It's now a largely Muslim town of 28,000 people. But a story popped up this week. The LGBT community is sort of quite upset about all of this. And I suppose the delicious irony is they're saying that in the beginning we thought, all these Muslims are coming to the town of Hamtramck. This is wonderful for diversity, etc., etc. And then they've sort of turned it back on them, and now they feel betrayed.
Yes, I mean, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh, wouldn't you? It's a story that has played out repeatedly in Europe, in Canada, and other liberal countries in recent years. It's that wonderful moment when one minority discovers that just because they're a minority and they've met another minority doesn't necessarily mean the other minority adores them. Who could have guessed, other than those of us who said this for a long time and were ignored and sometimes ridiculed? It's plain as anything that the Muslim world does not adore homosexuality. All the studies show that. And even when Muslims come to Western countries, it doesn't mean that they get straight in line with the LGBTQIA plus agenda in particular. And yes, as I say, I mean, the rather plaintive cries of local gay activists who said, hey, we supported the Muslims when they came into our town. How come they're not supporting us? All one can say is, welcome to the real world, darling.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend until they're not, certainly in this case. The US Senate, I can't believe this. They've erased their dress code standards. So now the number 2 Senate Democrat, Dick Durbin, he's given his opinion on the decision. Here's what he had to say.
Well, I'm concerned about it. The senator in question from Pennsylvania is a personal friend. but I think we need to have standards when it comes to what we're wearing on the floor of the Senate, and we're in the process of discussing that right now as to what those standards will be.
Now, this has all been done for John Fetterman, who rocks around most of the time in hoodies and shorts. You know, he has to stick his head into the chamber or vote from doorways because he hasn't been allowed on the floor of the Senate. You know, I sort of take the view that if you want to work in a professional job, you have to dress like a professional. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't be there in the first place. But have a listen to this. This is Fetterman responding this week to Republicans slamming this decision.
Well, you know, her platform, you know, really, she runs on more and more ding-a-ling, you know, picks, you know, on in the meetings over in Congress. So again, I'm not really sure why she cares how I dress, but you know, she really takes it a different way.
Now, I'm not sure we want to know about John Fetterman's ding-a-ling, but what on earth is going on here, Douglas? Where are the standards?
Well, the first thing is, I mean, John Fetterman is a really sad case. He had a massive stroke when he was running for the Senate, and the Democrats just made him continue to run anyway. And neither his wife nor any of his family seem to have said the decent thing, which was, for God's sake, stop. The man is suffering badly in public. And even now, when he's partially recovered, he's clearly not all there. And it's very sad. Of all the people who are cognitively impaired in the Senate, John Fetterman really stands out, and that's really saying something. But the striking thing about Fetterman is, yes, I mean, this sort of slovenly dress is, as you say, something which it would be embarrassing in a school, but in the Senate of the United States is really something. I have a colleague at the New York Post, John Levine, who yesterday in New York went around some of New York's restaurants dressed as Senator Fetterman and wasn't allowed in to quite a number of the New York restaurants. And it proved a very interesting point. How is it that if you dress like John Fetterman, you wouldn't be allowed into some of the smarter restaurants in New York or DC, but you are allowed into the Senate? I don't think it's the biggest thing, but it is a sign of a type of decline in the Senate and I think in Washington as a whole.
I think it means the West is falling. It's the same in the office. I see all these people wearing untucked shirts and unironed shirts and short sleeves. You know, dress up for the office. Now, very quickly before we go,
there are even people without pocket handkerchiefs you see sometimes.
I know, and I reckon that's a dead set disgrace. Now, very quickly before we go, I mean, you know, it's another week of Biden gaffes, but I've just quickly got to show you one of my favourites, his interaction with the President of Brazil. I mean, he wouldn't even shake his hand, and the president at the end, he's clearly just so knotted. He's like, I'm out of here. How good.
Yeah, it's everyone who's on stage at any time with Biden, friend or foe, has to expect the unexpected at any moment. And he might walk out halfway through your speech. He might just leave at the end and forget that you're there. That's, as I've said to Rita before, that's the peril of the American president always being literally one footstep away from disaster.
Yes, at least one thing we can say about Biden, he does wear a suit. Thank you, Douglas Murray, for joining me tonight.
Great pleasure as always.